My name is Tom Redden. I want to say it really is an honor for me to be here with you all. I know that you have busy lives. I know that you have a lot going on in your life. And so I'm really grateful that you've taken the time tonight. I want to begin by thanking our host. And to begin, Director Star Electronica, the wonderful work she does here at the library. I want to thank Seth Thomas, who's the town of Brattleboro communication coordinator, who did a bunch of the outreach here and the graphics. It's beautiful. I want to thank Matt Wosick, who helped set up this audio, and especially Maria Dominguez, who is a very, very talented videographer, a wonderful, wonderful person, and a great asset to all of us here in Brattleboro. So I want to thank you all for making this possible. In light of our busy lives, I want to invite folks to take just a minute here to gather ourselves, if we could. And feel free to take a couple deep breaths. Feel free to close your eyes. And to bring our full selves, heart, mind, body, to this room, to this event, and to being with the wonderful people who are here among us and with us. That we bring ourselves to this very moment. And with that, to acknowledge with gratitude the blessings that all of us have been bestowed. We live in a remarkably beautiful part of the world. Wonderful people, committed people, caring people. And so we can sit here together and appreciate the life that we have. So, in preparing for today's talk, as with most talks that I give, I always have one question that I come back to. And the question is, what is this about? What is the talk about? What am I trying to share? What am I trying to say? What am I hoping that you take away here? What is it? What is the nugget, the kernel, the essence of what this is about? By the same token, as in your coming here, it seems to me there's also the question, what are you looking for? Are you looking for an answer? We talk about Buddhism and politics. You're looking for confirmation for your own views. Are you looking to be challenged? Are you looking for, oh, I have nothing else to do. Who is this guy? This may be interesting. Why don't I give it a go? Or, you know, my television doesn't work and I don't know what else to do. The question here is, why are we here? You know, the advertisement says this is about the Buddhist world, Buddhism and politics. And I am eager to hear what folks have to say after I share my own thoughts. And what I realize, what I really want to do here is I want to speak to your hearts. My ultimate concern here is about the political situation in the United States and beyond. And yet we're living in incredibly difficult and confusing times. And in our heart of hearts, what I hope you walk away from this is the idea that we are interconnected. We are interdependent. We depend on one another. As many of you may know, Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Vietnamese monk, poet, writer, activist, talked about interbeing. We inter-are. We are here with and among and almost in other people. We depend on one another. Republicans and Democrats rely on one another. Rich people and poor people, straight and queer, pro-Trump, anti-Trump, American, Chinese, Christian, Muslims, Palestinian, Israelis. We're also connected biologically in terms of the earth, the water, the trees, the bees, the environment. What I hope you walk away from is to reflect upon the question of how interconnected we are, the ways in which we share this world with one another. You know, the Western tradition, especially in the United States of America, we live in a hyper-individualistic culture. The cowboys that goes off at the end of the day is this iconic, heroic figure for much of our history. And yet I asked the question, who actually cooked the food that that guy ate? Who actually bred that horse? Who made the saddle? Where is he going that, you know, he's able to build a fire? You know, where are his parents and his siblings and his friends, and where is he going? The fact is, there is no such thing as the cowboy who rides out all by himself. And I think that, you know, we're in a very, very tumultuous time. I don't have to tell anybody in this room. And it seems to me at the heart of where we are is not that there are bad people and good people. You know, for a lot of people in Brattleboro, no question, they have a hard time understanding how millions and millions of people can follow particular political leaders. How can you support that? Many people ask that question. And I want to look at the question of what is the worldview of which we are a part, and which I am a part. In many ways, it's about the fact that we are separate. There is the mind, there is the body. There are our emotions, there is our intellect, our rational mind. The fact that we are separate from one another, that we are distinctive. Many of us sort of see ourselves as on the inside. I'm in here and you're out there. At a certain point, this becomes us and them, or me and you. And then we talk about nature. We're on concrete. I'm on this board here. We see ourselves as here and nature is out there. Even if you're in the woods, it's still, I am here and nature is there. And with this separateness, it becomes very easy for us to differentiate, to judge, to categorize. When it comes to nature, it means that we can use nature because it's there and it's not us. We can exploit it. We can, in fact, destroy it as long as we're taken care of. We see the universe as outside of ourselves. As separate beings from one another and from nature itself, we have gotten to the point where this is no longer tenable. This idea of separation. What Buddhism is arguing is that this notion of a separate self, this sense of self, the ego, that drives so many of our lives is in fact a construct. That this self, this separateness, in fact, is not the case. We talk about the idea of, I think, therefore I am. Descartes, René Descartes, 1627, something. And very quickly what that means, I am because of what I think, of what I do that is unique, what I do that is different. What I do that separates me from everyone else. And at the end of the day, what this means is that it is my ego. It is my opinion. It is my people. It is my party, my nation, my tribe that deserves priorities. When we see ourselves as separate, it is easy to judge, it's easy to categorize, it is easy to dismiss, because it's not us, it's not me. From a Buddhist perspective, all this comes back to the mind. How do we see the world? How do we perceive the world? Needless to say, our minds can fool us. They play tricks on us because of our emotions, because of our feelings. As many of you know, even eyewitness. I had a criminal justice professor friend. He used to do a little experiment. He would have a student, he'd class of 40 students in the classroom, just like here. Someone would come in, run and steal someone's, would steal that pocketbook and run out. And then during class, he would interview all these people and say, what did that person look like? Did they have a mustache? Did they have long hair? Were they white? Were they black? How old were they? And they found out that it was incredibly unreliable. People literally saw different, what their memories was that people saw different things. What Buddhism is arguing is that we need to slow down. We need to learn to be still. We need to learn to understand our mind, to understand how our mind functions. And that how that mind is something that is very easily led here and there. And the question is, if we never stop and slow down, where we have stillness in our heart, stillness in our body and our mind, how can we perceive the world accurately? How can we open ourselves up? If we're so busy, I think so much of this as the film. Each of us literally has a film going 24 hours a day, and of course we are the central character. We're the star of our own story. We are the star of our own narrative. And one of the beautiful things about this is that we write the script. It doesn't have to be true. Some of it may be too hard to really acknowledge. And so when I think about where we are as a country, it seems to me that the forces around us have solidified this notion of separateness, that we are not sharing the same world. Now, obviously, some of us would say we're living in a post-reality world, right? The fact that Joe Biden did not win the last election, that certain things actually don't exist. And this makes it very difficult for us to say what's really going on here when we can't even agree upon reality. You know, the good old days of Ronald Reagan, it was like, I mean, I won't go too far with Ronald Reagan, but the point is that it was an ideological question. Conservative, big government, small government, other things like that. It was ideas, but in theory, at least reality was the same. We're not there. One of my teachers, Joan Halifax, who probably is Zen Center, a great scholar, teacher, she talks about the fact that we are in a place of uncertainty in history. Not for the first time. And what she says is that in our practice, as practitioners, those of us, she's speaking as a practicing Buddhist, she's saying, as a practicing Buddhist for me, and again I'm quoting her, is that she says, my whole life has prepared me for this time of uncertainty. My whole life has prepared me for this time of uncertainty. And the question is, how do we move forward with this uncertainty? Another great teacher, one of my heroes, Joanna Macy, says that we don't know what's going to happen. We do the best we can. We simply don't know. And she says, if anybody tells you they know what's going to happen politically or anything else, run the other way, because they're full of baloney. She says, the one thing that we can control, if you will, or the one way for us to move forward in the world with all of the uncertainty is to be clear on our intentions. It is in our intentions that we live, and that we can move forward in spite of all the bad news that inundates us on a daily basis. The other piece about meditation that, again, I want to put at the beginning of the presentation tonight, and it doesn't have to be meditation per se in sort of the Buddhist sense, but the question of learning to be quiet, to be still, to be contemplative, to develop a spiritual life. You know, we live in a country, and I have my iPhone, but let's imagine it's here, right? The genius that goes into the iPhone is absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, imagine 20 years ago if you said, oh, all the information that's ever been in every single library in the world, every movie that's out there, all the music that's out there, more information you can also take a movie, you can use a flashlight, you know, you can measure, you know, distance between here and there with your iPhone. I mean, my goodness. We have lived in a culture in which the external world has received so much attention, and it has received such a high level of development, it's absolutely breathtaking. The question is, how developed are we internally, in terms of our inner lives? How well, you know, when Netflix goes bad, I have a simple choice. I mean, it's real easy. I just go to Hulu, right? No problem. One of the others can work. We have options. You know, if the hot tub isn't, we don't have a tub, if the tub isn't hot, I'm going to go to the colonial pool. If my bath at home isn't hot, I'm going to the colonial pool, and I'm going to take a hot tub. And I'll see Peter, then we'll turn on the jets, and the material world in which we live is absolutely breathtaking. But how about the internal world? How freely do we walk without judging others, without categorizing? Oh, do you listen to Fox, or do you listen to, you know, CNN and the rest of it? Do you drive a foreign car, or do you drive the Ford? Right? Do you shop at the co-op, or are you at, it used to be, the Chop? When we are living in our separateness, what happens is that we have walls in front of us. And where I believe, I think, it's just what I see in looking at Buddhism and politics is living the moral life, but also, and having that spiritual practice on a daily basis that allows me to get out of my ego, to let go of my opinions, to let go of my sense of self, so that in fact the walls slowly disappear, the ego sort of dissipates, and the separation between me and everybody else simply begins to dissolve. Slowly but surely, the forces of compassion. Buddhism talks about this notion of bodhicitta. The energy of compassion comes forth. The more I let go of myself, the more I can be not separate from others, the more I can be in nature. And in fact, the more I can appreciate. And for me, what Buddhism and Zen in particular is about is to see the fundamental oneness of this life. And this is very trite, right? Tried and true, the oneness. But when we think about sitting here, if I'm sitting on this little platform here, and as I breathe, as I take this breath, is it all about the movie that's going on inside? Or can I slowly, in the breathing process, let go of who I am, simply be totally focused on this moment, right here, right now. Here I am. Slowly but surely the walls dissipate. They sort of just disappear. And my breath becomes part of the air. It's part of the air that you are breathing. And if all of us we are here together, we are breathing the same air. We let go of ourselves. We appreciate the fact that we are here together. And that we are here in this building, which is part of this time, which is part of this environment. And at the end of the day, it seems to me that in order for us to move beyond the crises in which we live right now, we've got to move outside of ourselves. We've got to let go of our opinions and our identities, to open ourselves to the wonder of this life. In Buddhism, we talk about the belief that everybody has Buddha nature. Everybody is capable of waking up and become a Buddha. You know, I grew up the good Irish Catholic boy. I loved the church. I loved going to church. The idea that every single one of us is a child of God. That every single one of us here could be Jesus on earth. We don't know. Jesus may be the person on the street with the sign down at the co-op. Jesus may be the person in the street at the bank. We don't know that. And so the more we're able to let go, the more we're able to open our hearts and understand that we are not separate. And again, what the vision that I understand for a Buddhist politics is what I call and others call, but what I'm calling a politics of compassion. And again, I'm not the only one who's come up with this, but to me it captures where we need to go in our politics if we are going to survive. And it's not obvious that we will. A politics of compassion means that what we focus on is simply being open to the world, being open to the reality of this life right here, right now. And as we do that, we become very much in touch with not only our own selves, but everyone around us. And we become acutely aware of the suffering in the world. A politics of compassion is a politics Human rights are important. Individual rights are important. All the things that came out of the liberal theories of the 1500s, John Locke, Rousseau, all of these folks, they were revolutionary at the time. Coming out of feudalism, they were just a remarkable development in human history and in human consciousness, that the king no longer, the feudal lord no longer controlled your life, that you controlled your life. And now in human history, 500 years later, we have gone so far that we feel we have a right, almost a divine right, to do exactly what we want. And the fact is that the more we look at ourselves and the power and the wealth, the more it confirms the idea we can do whatever the hell we want. And yet, again, what we need to do, in my opinion, is to let go of this ego, to let go of this arrogance. Open ourselves, literally, to the life that is around us. And in the process of looking deeply at where the real struggles in the world is, we see, number one, the full flourishing of our own humanity. You know, the Dalai Lama said famously, if you want to be happy, be compassionate. If you want others to be happy, be compassionate. So let me end this sort of introduction with this notion of a politics of compassion. I believe that as a culture, as a world, that we need to develop our inner lives, whatever those practices may be, whatever those traditions may be. And in many ways, what we find is that we go back to what we call the sort of indigenous traditions. You know, for most traditions around the world, Native Americans, India in the day, places all over the world, I think without exception, there was no such thing as religion. People just lived their lives, and what we call religion was simply a part of it. And so in many ways, we may be going back to the wisdom of the ages that allow us to inform the miraculous technology that we've developed, and yet the arrogance that has come with that technology, with that level of comfort, that incredible wealth and power. We have the power literally to destroy the world with nuclear weapons, etc. And then obviously with global warming, we're on this very, very delicate line at the moment. And so my understanding, and I say this with great humility, I don't pretend to know. In my tradition, the Zen Peacemaker Order, of which I'm a part, which I'm a priest, is that we have three tenets. The first tenet is not knowing. Bernie Glassman, this is his creation. He was my teacher for 15, 20 years. Not knowing, we don't know. But it means we let go of our opinions. We let go of what we're sure. We open ourselves. We have an innocence, an openness, not naive and not let people, exploit us, but to have an openness. The expert only has one way to do it. The beginner has 100 ways to do it. The first tenet, not knowing. The second tenet is we bear witness. We bear witness to the joy and the suffering of the world. Both. And there is no separation. There is no. It is on the same continuum. I eat that hot fudge sundae. I go to Ben & Jerry's and I say, please, I'd like a hot fudge sundae. I want vanilla, 2 scoops, and I want more hot fudge than you can imagine. And I want an adequate amount of whipped cream to match it. And then I let it melt for about 10-15 minutes, temporize, so that the hot fudge and the whipped cream and the vanilla Ben & Jerry's ice cream becomes one. Joy. It's all over. It's gone. I'm too full to have another one. the joy and suffering of the world, Ben and Jerry's hot fudge. The third piece, not knowing, bearing witness, loving action, right? I finished the hot fudge, loving action, I'm grateful for this, right? We do the best we can based on not knowing, based on speaking to the reality of what we see out there. We do the best we can, and we simply, we're going to have to accept what happens. So let me stop there in terms of this introduction, which was a very long introduction, needless to say. And what I'd like to do is move on to the question of the time of the Buddha. And, part of a question that I ask myself, well, what the heck is the relationship between these two things, right? We're going to go to politics, compassion, to the time of the Buddha, and talk about economics and other things. And for me, one of the things that I think that in terms of this next stage of human existence, we are walking this very, very intense tightrope. Where are we going to go? Is to, to explore exactly what is it that is going to help us out. And I mean individually. For some of us, it may mean, to balance our lives, to let go of that ego, to let go of our anxiety, is to dig deeply into the reality of the moment, to see in fact what comes to the surface. And so in my study of Buddhism, what I've come to is the fact that I feel I need to understand what was taken at that time, to understand the teachings from which this environment came. And as we move forward, the question is, where are we as a country? Why is it that 40% of the country supports these folks and 45% support these folks? What is it about that? And I think that we have to have an openness if we're going to do that. And so what I'd like to do is move to the topic of the world of the Buddha. And what I'd like to do is begin with this map, the Maurya dynasty. And if I were really clever, I'd have this up on a screen and it would be multicolored, but I'm not that clever. Do folks have that? There are more up here. Looks like people have it. Lovely. So, let me talk a little bit about, so I'm going to talk about Indian history, ancient India, and what we call early Buddhism. My background is academically as a political scientist. I have a PhD in political science, I have a couple of graduate, master's degrees in other topics. I've lived all over the world. I've traveled to every single state in the United States of America. I've taught in prisons, I teach in prisons, rich schools, poor schools, etc. Political science, I'm 67 years old, here I am, a privileged white guy, right? The guy who sort of has doors open just because they happen to be born in a particular way, through no fault of my own or doing of my own. I've tried to never forget, the privileges that I carry. And I say that in the context of trying to understand India 2,500 years ago, 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago. I spent a month in India 40 years ago. It was incredible, the northern part of the country. I went to Bogai where the Buddha was, supposedly where the Buddha was enlightened, and spent time in that part of the world where he lived. India, ancient India, is a very, very difficult topic. The other thing I want to say, so my background is in political science. I have a long-term Buddhist practice. I am a Zen Buddhist priest, the Zen Peacemaker Order. I have a 45-year daily meditation practice, which informs all of this reflection on my part. And the college I taught at, Southern Vermont College over in Bennington High School, I loved. first generation school, working class school, just magic for me. Closed a few years ago, tragically, truly tragically. And I started on a book full-time about Buddhist politics. And the book is looking at the history of Buddhist leaders and what they had to say from the Buddha on down, up until today, literally 2,500 years of what Buddhist leaders said about politics. The Buddha had a lot to say about it. And then to develop a model of so-called Buddhist politics, if there's such a thing, and then apply that to America, United States today. Poverty, climate crisis, racism, sexism, criminal justice, etc. The problems, if you will, that we're dealing with, the controversies. Studying India 3,000 years ago means that we are taking a giant leap across time and space. So from a purely chronological point of view, I want to highlight that we are in very, very tentative, very delicate area when we talk about what happened. The fact is, we don't know what happened at that time. Do we know for sure that the Buddha lived? We don't. Have scholars looked at this for many, many years? The answer is absolutely yes, and they believe, in fact, that he did. And let me talk for a little bit just about what we understand to be the teachings of the Buddha. The writings of the Buddha, the most complete set of teachings is called the Tripitaka, pronouncing it, but it's the three baskets in the language of Pali, P-A-L-I, which is a version of Sanskrit, all of which comes down from Indo-European family of languages. The most complete record of the Buddha's teachings is in Pali, and it's been translated into lots of other languages, including English. And here's the dilemma. It's believed that the Buddha died. The most recent scholarship suggests the Buddha died in about 400 BCE. When I started to study this 30 years ago, most scholars believed he died in 483. Think about everything that happens in 80 years. I don't care what time in history, it's a lot. And so for 2,400 and, however many years, scholars thought the Buddha died in the late 400s. The last 20, 30 years, they've come to the conclusion it's more like 400. The answer is, scholars don't know. We don't even know when the Buddha died. The thousands of pages of his teachings that do exist, that are from Pali, the Buddha died in 400. We talk about how reliable they are. He dies in 400. He dies up in, if you look at where Bodhgaya is, it's basically Magadha, it's to the north of that. Kapilavastu is where he dies. It's in northeastern India. So he dies in northeast India. Nothing is written down directly about his teachings for almost 400 years. And the writing that's written down in Pali is in Sri Lanka, one of the great monasteries in Sri Lanka by the Buddhist scholars at that time. So you have 1,500 miles of traveling that this oral tradition traveled. You have an oral tradition, call it 300, call it 400, however many generations, 10 generations, 15 generations. People lived, we're talking till 20, maybe 30 at that time, not more than 30. So we're talking dozens of generations. The Buddha's teachings, it's pretty clear the Buddha was not literate and didn't write a thing, and the people around him were illiterate. It was passed on orally. Now, due to the early Hindus that I'm going to talk about, the Vedas and the Brahmins, the Vedic priests and leads into Brahmanism, they had developed in India a remarkable method to memorize text. And it took me about 6 months to understand that when the scholars talk about T-E-X-T, they don't mean written text. I thought text was always something that's written. Text can be oral. It's basically some record. It's a record or something. That's what a text is. So there were oral texts for literally hundreds of years from the time the Buddha died until it was written down in its entirety in Sri Lanka 1,500 miles later. Think about all the possibility for those teachings to change. And so you can just imagine, and this is the thing about Buddhism at that time, there were all sorts of strife and battles within the Buddhist community. There were the monks who were very conservative and those who wanted to be more open. You know, can we touch money? Nope. Well, what do you mean we can't touch money? That's ridiculous. Can I eat after 12 o'clock? Nope. Well, that's ridiculous. I'm hungry for the rest of the day. I'm very weak. I need to eat. Nope. That's the tradition. So there are all sorts of battles that took place. All of which is to say that the record, there's the text that we have today, there's the archaeological evidence, and then there's the literature, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, these great early Hindu, Vedic, Brahmin texts, you know, written over hundreds of years. These are like the Iliad and the Odyssey of India at this time. These sort of epic stories. They were both stories and they were history. But that's all we got. That's all we have. So when we talk about what the Buddha said, we need to be very careful. We need to be modest. We need to be humble. So when I talk about the Buddha said this, there's the caveat that I've laid out there. Okay? This is what we think he said. All right. So when we talk about, so the time of the Buddha, in many ways, was like the time we're living today, because the level of change that took place in Eastern India, where he grew up, was at a breakneck pace for that time in history. And it came from changes in technology. And I'll get to this, but very simply, it's because iron becomes mass-produced in Eastern India. Iron had existed for probably 400 or 500 years. So we're talking 500 BCE. 2,500 years ago, iron was probably discovered, maybe in the Middle East, makes its way slowly. Copper was the metal before that. Copper's not very strong, and wood won't get you far when you're trying to chop a tree down, or you're trying to cut someone's head off. We'll get to that. Anyways. So this is time of really just unprecedented change in Eastern India. And what I want to do is just draw our attention to sort of what was going on that brought about this change. So India, now what I have here in the, in terms of what I brought, I just brought a few photocopies. One of them talks about Buddhism, okay? This is not I'm sorry to say for those folks who aren't that clear on all the aspects of Buddhism or the basics are laid out there, and I'm sorry to say we're not going to sort of get into that. I'm happy to answer any specific questions. And yet, what we want to do at the moment is look at how the changes that take place in Eastern India at the time of the Buddha, again, about 500 BCE, what are some of the dynamics that are taking place there? And so I'm just going to jump through Indian history. Indigenous folks, so-called indigenous folks, came to India. Originally, it is believed, probably from Africa up and down the coast through the Persian Gulf, the west coast of India, and that those same folks continued on to around Indonesia, Micronesia, that area, and at a certain point they made their way to the southeastern shores of India. And these are the folks that are considered so-called, I don't know this proper term, but let's say indigenous the oldest, inhabitants of India. Now, the folks who come in and chart the next, 3,000 years of Indian histories come down, they're called the Aryans, right? Aryans. Of course, the Nazis, took this term because the term itself means noble, that we are the noble ones. So there's a certain presumptuousness by the Aryans who come in. The Aryans are tribes that come down from Central Asia, north of the Caspian Sea, north of the Black Sea, and some scholars used to talk about the invasion of the Aryans, that they would come down around those areas, that they would come down what is now present Iran, that would go into Afghanistan, and basically come into what is the Indus River Valley, which is now in Pakistan. The great series of rivers in what was early on Western India. And so the Aryans are this tribal force, they're nomadic, they're pastoralist, and they slowly make their way, for a number of reasons, into what we would call Western India. And again, if you look at the map here, you can see the Indus River under Gandhara, Kandahar in Pakistan. But basically, is that there were the 5 rivers there that all came from the Himalayas and the incredible amount of water that they had. And that was the basis of the so-called first urbanization in India. And the thing about that is that they had basically a written language. The difficulty is that language has never been deciphered. After all this time, nobody knows what the culture ultimately was about. And there were lots of pictograms and cuneiform type of characters that they had, but no one's been able to understand it even till today. So it's something of a mystery. The Aryans come down slowly but surely, and the Indus Valley civilization, really fascinating what we know about it, and it basically dies out. It's around for a couple thousand years, in fact. The last 500 years, it was mature, and basically it's very interesting. No one really knows why this great civilization in this Indus River Valley, this whole area of incredibly rich soil, etc., why it came to a close. I think there may have been actually a climate crisis, there may have been a drought, could have been overpopulation, and they think it may have been an earthquake that just sort of had a huge impact on the area. They make their way slowly. So what happens is that the Indus Valley fades out and people live in villages. The city, if you will, urbanization of the Indus Valley, it's gone. Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, they're gone. And so this is all village life at this time. The Aryans come down, there's 2 things that they have. They have the horses and they have chariots. And they have a technology that's way ahead of all the local folks. And they make their way and they become the dominant force in ancient India, and to a certain extent, the Aryans, as I understand it, and the culture they developed, continue to dominate. And we're talking about the Brahmin class, the upper classes that come out of that, in many ways forged the next 3,000 years of Indian history. So what happened is that these Aryan tribes come down, and slowly but surely they settle around this huge river system in Western India. But at a certain point, it proves to be too dry. And so they begin to migrate across north central India, and they head toward the Ganges River Valley, this unbelievably rich area of, the monsoon seasons went roughly from July, August, September into October, a good 3 months every year. The rivers just swelled and became seas. unbelievably rich soil. And so what happened is that the Aryans made their way across India and began to settle in eastern India. And so what happens economically is a result of a development of technology. The time of the Buddha, again, let's call it 500. Let's say he's dead by 400. By that time, iron has been introduced. And there's a number of things that happen because of iron. Number one, at that time in India, and this surprised the heck out of me when I read it, because I was in eastern India, you couldn't see a tree anywhere. Dry as could be. In the day, it was almost all of it was forest land. Trees that had been there for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years that were full of animals, tigers, elephants, snakes. I mean, it was known as danger zone for anybody to go into the forest, but incredibly rich. The challenge, of course, in eastern India in this time was that you couldn't cut the trees down. Copper didn't make it, and you couldn't, anyways. Iron transforms that. They develop the axe. They start clearing land. They develop an iron plow. And before you know it, the land is cleared, the agricultural produce is that much more productive. The population begins to grow significantly. Rice becomes a universal crop. The rice had certain qualities that provided protein and nourishment. I'm not sure protein, but provided nourishment that the Indians at that time never had before. It provides so much nourishment that that women were able to nurse much more productively, and that their children lived and survived in the first years of their life. And so what happened, the population grows. The population was healthier. They're clearing land everywhere. And so what happens with the growth of the produce, cows are still very much part of the scene, animals are part of the scene, but the agriculture absolutely explodes. What happens at that point is that there's surplus of agriculture. So people have more than just enough for sustainability and for their own self-reliance. They begin to trade it. And then all of a sudden you have these centers of trade. By the time of the Buddha, money had been introduced to Eastern India. Money facilitates trade. Banks begin to, lending organizations are literally able to loan money and finance new endeavors of farming. All sorts of, all sorts of crafts are being produced at a massive scale. So what happens when the Buddha, by the time the Buddha is born and becomes an adult and becomes the teacher that he became, Eastern India is transformed from what had been a relatively quiet, relatively village-based part of the world to a commercial hub. Towns develop as the trade continues. Cities develop as the trade continues. If you look at the map, the center of power in India becomes Magadha. And that's if you look at the right-hand side of India, the part that sticks out, Magadha, that becomes the commercial center. The great thing about Magadha for them is that they also had iron in the mountains. So they were able to produce iron, which they were like the tech folks of the day. the millionaires and in fact billionaires of the day. There is incredible wealth for the first time in Indian history. And so you have this dynamic of more towns, more cities. You have specialization within the economy. You have all these new jobs. And you have villages that do nothing but make a particular craft. I haven't talked about the so-called caste system, which is somewhat different layers to it, but that continues to develop very much as specialization continues. People become identified by the work that they do, which is basically historically how they've done it as well. So you have this dynamic of the second great urbanization in eastern India. And what happens is that the village life that had existed in central and western India that were dominated by the Aryans, and the Aryans that established their own culture, and very quickly. That culture consisted over time of a four-part caste system. The priests, the Brahmins were at the top. You had the so-called warriors, the political folks were the second, the Kshatriyas, I don't know my pronunciation of Sanskrit. The third were the merchants and the farmers, and the fourth were the servants who served the other three. It was all based on purity, about cleanliness, and all of this. And so what happened is that the village-based culture that the Aryans had established for a good 500, 1,000 years in Western India, as they were making their way across to Eastern India, the Aryans and that village-based culture, that culture based on the four castes, the culture that was based on the family, where a young man, you studied as a young man, you got married, you had children, you enjoyed all the pleasures of married life. And there's no being shy about this. It's food, it's sex, it's having a nice house, it's having all the toys of the time. And there were toys at the time for wealthy people to enjoy. And so this structure that the Aryans had brought into India, that became the dominant structure, when it arrived in Eastern India, where the Buddha lived at the Buddha's time, it met resistance. And what happened at that time is that the Buddha comes to represent a new development in Indian history. So again, we have the Aryans, who are the sort of dominant culture. They made their way across, and they're sort of making their way slowly but surely into Eastern India, but they're not there 100%. If you look at the map, let's go to the next map here. This one here, we'll get right to this, is that, actually, let's look at this one here, India at the 600 BC. The Mahajanapadas are basically, they're states. They're not countries, but you can think of them. They're political entities. So these are the great political entities, and this is what I'm going to talk about next time, is the politics at that time. I'm just going to touch on it today. So what we see is that again, if you look at the Indus Valley, the Aryans make their way across there. Kuru is the first great, what we call government or state, about 700-800 BCE, a few hundred years before the Buddha showed up. Panchala, another very, very powerful state. You make your way to Kosala, Mala, and Virji. That's where the Buddha grows up. And so it's in that part, from Kosala down to Magadha, and where Vatsa and Anga, that is the heart of the second urbanization in Indian history. That's where this incredibly dynamic commercial, and we have to emphasize, this is a commercial culture, and there are commercial values. This is the values of the city. And then you find this anywhere in the world. Think about it. You know, the people who grew up in the countryside, small town, you knew everybody. Very conservative, very provincial, you know everybody. You know what your grandfather did and your grandfather and your great-grandfather, and that's what you did. And somebody who comes in from the outside, who are they? I don't know. Can we trust them? And this is the way of the world. This is not new, and it has nothing to do with geography. I don't care where in the world it is. And so you have this village culture of the Aryans now being challenged by the emergence of a new center of economic and political power in eastern India. And I want to highlight Magadha. It's not a city, it's an area. Think of it as a state, if you will. And again, they didn't have drawn territories because they changed all the times because they're often at war and it just changed. So what happens at this time in Indian history, into which the Buddha is born, is the fact that his home, if you look here on the other map, I love this map, this one here. And I apologize, I don't have a multicolored printer. I have no excuses. What you see is, if you look at it up in those are the Himalayan mountains, as you can imagine, with the little, whatever they are, triangle sort of things. That's all the Himalayas. That's Nepal, okay? If you see Kalia up there and Lumbini, up in the upper right-hand corner, right below Sakya, that's in Nepal, okay? Lumbini is where the Buddha was born. Everyone sort of thinks it's where Nepal, the western end of Nepal. Sakya, that's the clan of the Buddha, the Sakyas. You know, he's known as Shakyamuni Buddha, the enlightened, the awakened ones of the Shakyas, of the Shakya tribe and clan. If you look at that map, Magadha is the center of it. Now, if you look at Bodhgaya, that's where the Buddha was enlightened. Okay, he hung out there. Rajagaha is the capital at the time. Its name changes a number of times. Nalanda is where the great Buddhist so-called university, Nalanda University, that's where that was, and in fact, it as far as I know, exists still today. Okay. The Buddha is born in Lumbini. If you go down just to the lower left, Kapilavastu. Kapilavastu is where he basically grew up. Kapilavastu is the capital of the Shakya little republic. It's like a small state. It is a small state. At the time of the Buddha, the Shakya little state was controlled by Kosala. Look to the left of Kushinagara and Mala. There is, or if you look on the big map, you see Kosala. Kosala was the second most powerful state in India at that time. Very, very powerful. Magadha was the most powerful. The Buddha grows up in this urbanized area. Now what's interesting about his people in Kapilavastu is that he's on a trading route. It's the last trading city between Magadha, the center of trade, and if you go all the way up to Gandhara, this is on the India 600 BC map. Look how far, I mean, Gandhara is way up, or if you look at the 265 Maurya dynasty map, I'm sorry about this. If you look at that map, you can see Magadha, and then the road heads north, and it goes through Kapilavastu, which is where the Buddha grew up, and you'll see the road, what's called the North Road, continues sort of just on the side of the Himalayas and goes all the way up to Kandara, however it's pronounced. This great city there is Taxila. This is one of the great cities of the world at that time, because you had all this influence from basically what we would call the Middle East, but also from Central Europe. and also to a certain extent from China. That was a trading place that was like Istanbul. It's in the middle of these different crossroads. There is the hypothesis that the Buddha went to school there as a young man. Because he grew up as a wealthy young man, that the wealthy folks, you know, they go to Exeter and Andover and places like that. There they would go to Taxila because they would get a very metropolitan, a very sort of international, very sophisticated education there about the military, about how to govern, all the rest of it. So what happened is that the Buddha grows up at this time of incredible change. And I have to emphasize that there is a value system into which he is born, and it's one of materialism. It's one of acquisitiveness. It's one of wealth. It's one of, living the fast life. You know, it's like the country parents who are afraid that their son or daughter is going to go to the big city and be corrupted. This is it. The Buddha grows up in a place that's at the edge of the Himalayas. They're sort of hill people to a certain extent. They see themselves as apart. They're on the North Road, but they're apart from Magadha and the really big cities. And they're very proud. They don't listen to other people very well. And it's interesting that some of the parts of the Buddha's story in his life that we believe may have happened speak to this real independent nature. And it's interesting how that may have had an impact on him. The Buddha grows up in Kapilavastu. Age of 29, he decides, it's hard for me to imagine. His wife just had a baby. He's very restless. He taps into a tradition there that's called the Shramana tradition. At that time, there is an offshoot of the Aryan religion, Vedism and Brahmanism, which had the 4 classes. Early on, they had all sorts of sacrifices, animal sacrifices, the horse sacrifices, and then it led to eventually Brahmanism and the idea of karma, the idea of rebirth, the idea of moksha or salvation. So the Buddha is growing up at a time in which philosophically there's all sorts of things going on, economically, socially, and he's restless. He's in Kapilavastu. It's sort of an out-of-the-way place. Supposedly married, beautiful, princess. He loves his wife. The child is born. He's so restless. He's going to join the wanderers. At that time in Indian history, and I'm going to pick up next time with this idea. And I'll finish up in a couple minutes, and then I'm eager to hear what you all have to say. And so what happens is that the Buddha becomes part of this very dynamic movement. It's called the heterodox. There's what's called the orthodox. They're the mainstream folks. They they follow the rules. The orthodox folks. The heterodox are those groups that challenge the orthodox. He's in this heterodox movement of Shramanas, and there's different characteristics. Number one, they're wanderers. They literally, the strict ones, they never sleep in the same place. They never sleep indoors. Some of them are naked every day of the year. So number one, they wander. Number two is that they're ascetics. They've rejected the sort of, Sakyan, Vedic, Brahmin way of life, which very much honors materialism, honors the family, honors the household, honors your role to be a good son, get married, have children, take care of your parents. They reject the Shramanas, these ascetics, these heterodox excuse me, they reject that wholeheartedly. And their life commitment is to wake up. To wake up to an enlightenment, which means that they will not be reborn. They will not be reborn in another lifetime. Life was very, very, very difficult. The idea of being reborn yet again was not something that may be hard for us to say, geez, I'd love to be reborn and, I'll eat more ice cream. It can't be that. But at that time, that's simply not where folks were. And so the Buddha literally becomes a part of this heterodox, anti-establishment movement of wandering ascetics. At that time in the Buddha, it was believed that there were 63 different philosophies. And what happened is that you would have a teacher that would roam the streets and the countryside of India. They were on their own. Some of them were all by themselves. Some of them had a following. And what was interesting is that time of the Buddha, they were welcome. It was part of Indian life. These folks would come to town, they would sleep outside, but what they would do, they would go to the houses and they would beg. And they would be given alms, and therefore that's how they would sustain themselves. It became part of the culture. And so let me end here with just a few closing thoughts. In terms of the world of the Buddha at that time, it was a materialistic culture. He tapped into a minority aspect of that culture that in fact turned it upside down. The third piece is that when the Buddha became the Buddha, when Siddhartha Gautama became the Buddha, became enlightened, became a teacher, became one of those wandering ascetics, he was in competition with dozens and dozens and dozens of other folks. And what I'm going to talk about next time is that he had a tough job. He was selling his message. I used to think he just sort of walked through India and everyone followed him. Are you kidding me? He had a PR strategy. He had to make sure that the kings were happy with him, the real power. He had to make sure that the mother and fathers in the communities were happy with him. He had to make sure that the merchants were with him. He had to make sure that the rich people who supported these wandering ascetics were with him. Otherwise, he wouldn't have any disciples. Otherwise, he'd never have a monastery where his disciples would stay. The Buddha was political in terms of the community he lived, because number one, if the kings were unhappy with him, he could be dead in a matter of a couple minutes. This was a time of brutal, brutal political violence. It's also a time is that if you didn't have support of local people, you weren't going to go anywhere. He had two very, very powerful contenders, the Jains, G-A-I-N-S, and their leader, Mahavira. This guy was a superstar, and I mean a superstar. He may have been just as dynamic as the Buddha. And we'll talk about why Buddhism wins out, because Buddha ultimately has Ashoka, the great emperor. He's the guy, he's the political power to, 150 years later, where Buddhism spread and becomes a world religion. Without that, Buddhism may have simply stayed one of the many religions in Eastern India, in this area. The Jains never got that, and didn't get much of it. And then the Ajivikas were another group I'll talk about very briefly next time. So the point is that the Buddha's life was incredibly challenging. He left his wife and his children. I'm going to talk about what his think about what his father-in-law thought about him. You left my daughter and my grandson. Who the hell are you? You're welcome. I'm going to welcome you back in my time together. How about all the mothers and fathers who lost their sons and daughters to the monastery? The one mother says, you, Buddha, Mr. Buddha, you took my 3 sons away from me. His cousin, Devadatta, his cousin, close disciple, tries to kill the Buddha 3 times. 3 times, and he's still free. Kosala, these folks here, this is like the Buddha's, compatriots. The king, the second king in his lifetime, invades the Sakya land and literally annihilates virtually all the people in the Buddha's tribe and clan. His life was not a bowl of roses. It was a dynamic time. It was a very challenging. So we'll pick up here next time. You've been incredibly patient. I hope that you'll catch up on your sleep. And if you took a few nods, I don't blame you in the least. So I know this thing goes to, and if folks don't, at any point, if you need to go, again, don't worry. This is not about me. This is about hopefully this providing some things of interest for you. So the floor is wide open, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. And again, I will surely walk out of here a few minutes before 9, and I'll be here till then. But you should feel free to, be on the way at any point. It's all good. So the floor is open.
Thomas,
Sure, Peter.
this is a question I wanted to ask. In terms of modern world politics, I don't know. I'd be interested how many sovereign states are regarded as being Buddhist. I don't want to say dominated, but strongly influenced. I don't think it's that many, but
It's a great idea, great question.
But I think Myanmar, you could say, is one.
Absolutely.
And if compassion is the dominant, if you had to reduce Buddhism to one idea, it would be compassion for oneself and for the other. There is this appalling persecution of the Muslims going on in the northeast of the country, and how does that jive?
The short answer is it doesn't. The KKK claim to be Christian. Were they Christian? Well, not by our definition. Right? The persecution of the Rohingya, one can argue, is the most anti-Buddhist thing one can possibly imagine. And let me just speak for a couple so we're talking Burma. I don't know if it's 80% Buddhist, predominantly. So we talk about, so with Burma, Thailand, Bhutan, Tibet, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, right? And if we look at those countries, look at the horrific, terrifying violence, the Sri Lankan Civil War. The Sri Lankan Civil War in the day, when we were concerned about, the terrorism in the Middle East and all this area, and that was terrible. The center of terrorism in the world was Sri Lanka, by Buddhist-supported side as well as by the rebels in Sri Lanka. And so you have the civil war in Sri Lanka, where, and again, what we see is that nationalism. And this is, and I looked at this fairly closely in the last couple of years. What happens is that nationalism supersedes the principles of the religion. And I think we can see that almost any place in the world. If it's Judaism, if it's Islam, if it's Christianity, if it's Buddhism, if it's Hinduism, is the fact that when nationalism becomes this militant, at a militant level, where one's going to use violence in the name of their definition or your definition of the nation, then we really have absolute contradiction of Buddhist principles. The persecution of the Rohingya, in southern Thailand, where you have, next to Malaysia, and you have problems with Muslim populations there, and the southern Thai, who are Buddhist. there are some monasteries in southern Thailand that have armed the monks, which is totally antithetical to Buddhist principles. Now, in places like Sri Lanka, places like Burma, it's very rare for a monk to actually become a soldier and to go and kill people. But what the monks do is that they support the violence against these minorities. So I think in the same way that when nationalism supersedes the principles, then they violate those very principles. And this is the other thing I think it's important, is that, Buddhists often say there's never been a war that's fought for religious reasons by a Buddhist. There's never been a war in history. And to a certain extent, there may be some truth to that. At the same time, look at the Japanese. This was a scandal of the Zen Buddhist in Japan, close to my own lineage, is that during Japan, leading Zen Buddhist monks supported the Japanese war in Southeast Asia against the United States. And, Japan called this the Southeast Asian co-prosperity sphere. They invade, they literally took over Southeast Asia. And all of this was in the name that we are going to bring wealth and development to them. The level of violence, terror that the Japanese brought upon, the so-called rape of Nanking, absolutely terrifying, and the Buddhist monks are supporting this. This is obviously not that long ago. These are some of these people are fairly well educated, fairly sophisticated people, but nationalism really took absolute hold. And so in many ways the Buddhists aren't different than the other religions.
Well, yeah, and Christianity.
So there we are.
If you attach one word to Christianity, it would be love, and yet.
Love your enemy, love your enemy.
Yeah, in the name of Christianity, appalling atrocities
So thanks, Peter.
for centuries.
Yeah, great question. Sure, please, Ben.
Some scholars suggest that the Buddha himself that his father was involved in the military, or it was somehow a military person, and that the Buddha was Shakyamuni was headed for what would be the equivalent of officer school. Is there any truth to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the reasons I started this section by saying that I started this part about the Buddha's world by saying that it's very difficult to say exactly what happened at this time because the records are very contradictory and very thin. If you pick up X number of books today, they talk about the Buddha's father as a king because his position in Kapilavastu, this town, was the Raja, R-A-J-A. Raja means king. It also has a variety of other meanings. The scholars today are pretty clear. His father was not a king. His father lived in a town, Kapilavastu, where they had what we would talk about as an oligarchic republic. And what that meant is that you had all of these clans in town, right, in this area. We're talking thousands of people. This is not Brattleboro. This is this vast area. And that they have all these clans, and that the head of the clans were men. They would get together in an assembly, a somewhat democratic assembly, if you will, and they would make decisions. They would have voting, they would have procedures. It was not the king's fiat that would make a decision. The clan leaders would get together and they would vote. They would elect a leader. In Kapilavastu, the Buddha's father, Suddhodana, was that guy. He was like the mayor. He was the chief. Maybe call him a governor. He was more or less he was elected by this somewhat elite group, which was usually the oldest men in the clans. So his father was not a king, in which the king's father, that he simply assumed by virtue of birth. He was chosen because of his father's chosen because of his leadership. He had to be respected. He comes from a wealthy family. There's no question about it. The Buddha talks about having 3 palaces. I don't know, but the point is he was wealthy. So the father, let's call him the governor. It was not automatic that his son was going to become the governor also. His son had to be chosen by the elders at a given time. So, he was this superstar guy. Maybe it was a given. He was so talented everyone wanted to vote for him. So there's that possibility. Now, in terms of the military piece, if you're in the second class in India, the first, is the priest class. And so you learn about the Vedas, the text that you needed to learn. And you learned about the rites and the sacrifices. You needed to learn the hymns. That's what your job was as a priest. The second, the Kshatriyas, they were the warriors and they were the politicians. A lot of the kings came from that class. The kings didn't come from the Brahmin class. They came from the second class, but it's sort of like in Europe, this is an analogy, there was the church. The Pope, the cardinals, and the bishops, they were really, in many ways, they were high up there, but they weren't the kings and the princes. Those came from the nobility. The nobility had land, they had power, they had wealth. That's the kind of part where the Buddha's class was from. And so he came from that class. Caste, class, call it what you will. What that meant, he studied economics. He was tutored. He studied economics. He studied the military. Because in the second class, you were a military person. So he learned the way, martial ways. There's no doubt in terms of military strategy. India is is a sophisticated country at this point. A few hundred years after the Buddha dies, one of the great political treatises is written that's very much like Machiavelli's Peace of the Prince. And it's thorough, it's rational, it's very strategic. Anyway, so the point being that the Buddha grew up, his job was to learn the way of the military and all the others that had to do with governing. And, yeah.
The effect that was expressed was that it led him to be highly disciplined and to instill discipline in terms of the monasticism and studying, et cetera, and that sort of that militaristic discipline energy went into his.
That's interesting.
It's one theory.
I haven't heard that. Most of the stories talk about the fact that his father, before the Buddha was born, the story goes, is that they brought in one of these sort of like this mystic, right, who could predict the future. And one of these comes and says, oh, your son's going to be something special. He's either going to be an earthly king or he's going to be a great spiritual leader. The father says, if he becomes a spiritual leader, he's going to leave home, become a wandering ascetic, and we're never going to see our son. And so the story goes is that the father created a life of luxury for the Buddha. And we're talking about every luxury possible, and we're talking harems, right? This is like, these are times where they existed for rich people in India. We're talking about the best food in the world. We're talking about the best entertainment. We're talking about physical comfort. We're talking supposedly about 3 palaces that when it got cold in the winter, he went south. When it was warm in the summer, he would go to the mountains. So most of the stories say that he was spoiled, and then he marries this beautiful, beautiful princess. They had this incredible life, and he gives it up. So, but again, the stories are there, different stories. Thanks, Kay, I appreciate that.
Okay.
Yeah. Please.
I'm curious about this kind of clash between the rural folks and the
City folks?
yeah.
Yeah.
Are we talking about folks that are still all Aryans, or are these people that are coming from very different traditions? You know, behind.
That's a great question. Thank you so much. And your name again is?
Paul.
Paul, thanks, Paul. Well, you're Paul.
Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. We'll talk. On the map, scholars debate this. And the scholars I respect most on early Buddhism in India pretty much say the same thing. If we look at that area where the Buddha lived that I sort of outlined there, and again, so here it is. I mean, it's this area on the little map here, right? Is that if you look at the map of India, everything sort of to the west of that and to the north of that area is very Brahmin. And again, the religion of the Aryans begins what we call Vedism, V-E-D, because of the Vedas, which were the hymns, and it was sacrifice. That changes over time and becomes Brahmanism. Brahmin is the sort of ground of being, the great energy, the great God, if you will, which is a terrible word to describe it. But the great, the ultimate all-being is Brahmin, etc. And so Brahmanism is the religion at the time of the Buddha that is the dominant cultural, and this is the thing about the Aryans, is that it's religion, it's culture, it's the entire, if you will, the hegemony of what they establish in India. It is the dominant culture that permeates, society. Now, where the Buddha lived at, let's call it 500 to 400, the Brahmins have not made that. There are Brahmin villages, but it's not a Brahmin part of India at this point. And one of the great debates about the Buddha's teachings, there's an argument, this guy named Bronkhorst, this guy at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, he argues, and he backs up a little bit, he basically argues is that so much of what becomes India and all of this is from the Aryans. They bring their culture, they dominate. And he makes the argument that there is this group that comes out of this part of India, around Magadha. And he wrote this book called Greater Magadha, which is all this area. And he basically said they had an independent culture that gives rise to this wandering ascetic phenomenon. That so much of what the Buddha inherited was not from, western middle part of India, but came sort of locally from the culture that existed there. But basically, 200 or 300 years ago, that's not even true. I'm going to retract exactly what I said there. In time, India becomes, Hindu country, and Brahmanism becomes Hinduism. So, at this point, I think it's safe to say that, it's the Buddhists, it's the Jains, Ajivikas, these folks, they are very, very powerful. In Magadha itself, Mahavira, he's from those very cities. He's a superstar. He's bigger than the Buddha is there. There are, and again, when we talk about the Brahmin villages, it's the priests were there, that first class, and also the people who sort of follow that Brahmanism. So it's there at I'd say at a modest level, but by no means it's not dominant. And so the Buddha's really in a position that he can make a move to have some real influence there, and that's the environment. It's pretty wide open. It's dynamic, I think we can say. Yeah. That answer your question?
Kind of. I guess I'm curious then, who were these people?
Who were
earlier? Yeah, like did they,
Are you talking the village people?
no, sorry,
The bro-
the merchant class, the folks in Magadha,
Yeah.
that, well, in other words, the Aryans were coming in, and,
So who are
they
the
weren't
folks
the
who,
same people as the folks that were creating this more dynamic society. Who were they? Like, where did they come from, and what was their?
my sense is that the people who had been there forever, sort of indigenous people, and that one of the great scholars, this guy, Rhys David, you know, he wrote this book 120, 30 years ago, and he says that the religion at the time of the Buddha in the Buddha's area was very sort of animistic. That it was basically that everything has spirits. They believed in reincarnation. They believed in, you know, they believed that there were spirits in everything. So the idea of having Atman, you know, this sort of soul, or, you know, Brahman, the sort of ground of being in the universe, they bought all this stuff. But they bought very much the fact that there were spirits in, you know, the wind, in the rain, and all of that. And so the folks who, I mean, it's interesting, you know, if we, and again, I'll pick this up here. I think there's a combination of generations that come into Eastern India who were, you know, sort of full-fledged sort of Aryan immigrants, if you will, over time. I think there are others who are sort of, their, you know, ancestors simply have been there for, you know, well before the Aryans sort of show up. And I think that, but one of the things that happens is that the Aryans are migrating more and more toward the Ganges River Valley by the time the Buddha shows up. And so I think it's a combination. It's a very interesting question. I've never read a breakdown of, you know, if you take the population of Savasti, which is one of the largest cities at that time, how, you know, where their ancestors came from. My guess is some of them would have come from the West. My guess is most of them at that time would have been local people. That's my guess. And the thing is, I think in terms of becoming the merchant class, is that the merchant class is the third class. There's the Brahmins, there's the second class of the warriors, etc., and then there's the merchants and the farmers. And this is the thing about that, is that you had people who owned land, and with the surplus, they would trade. So they weren't the first class, but they may have still come down from the Northwest, but they always were in that third class. They were the ones who often became the, you know, the traders, because they had that surplus. And some of those, and they're, you know, we're talking hundreds of years, so after many, many generations, you know, their children, their grandchildren, great-grandchildren, they became merchants. They're no longer farmers because they had someone else. They became wealthier. Therefore, they weren't farming like their great-great-grandfathers, but they were now running the, you know, the commercial enterprise. And I think there was a lot of that going on. Yeah. I mean, they talk about in Magadha, one of the main cities, they're talking about something like, you know, 30,000 trading companies. 30,000. And we're talking tens of millions of people. It's a huge, huge population. Thank you for the question.
So I'm sure we could all listen to Tom for hours longer, but we need to have everybody out and things put back by 9. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. The next time is in whatever it is. There may be a thing up here.
There are things up there. And Steve, thank you for the sound. Oh.
Yeah, thank you so much. And if we can help, if you can spare a few minutes to just help move this stuff back, that would be great. Yeah. Okay, thanks.